Who dat and welcome in everybody. Today, news dropping where the Falcons might have found their coach for 2024. And if that's the case, we now know the coaching situation for all of the Saints opponents and their division rival in the Atlanta Falcons. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And this actually could have some implications on some of the people that we talked about Tuesday for the New Orleans Saints going at for offensive coordinator positions. Now, what all that ends up meaning, we'll have to wait and see. That said, it's worth talking about. I'm very curious to see how this is going to play. And I'll be honest, I am actually very, very surprised with what the Carolina Panthers chose to do. We'll talk about that in a bit. I am surprised by what we're hearing out of Atlanta. And I'm not going to take the easy route as a Saints podcast and just trash them. I'm not going to do that because there's always uncertainty when it comes to coaches. And I would argue that coaches are much harder to predict in terms of their success or failure than players are. And we'll see. That said, the name power of who they are going after certainly doesn't draw as much fear, anxiety, and heck, even animosity as some of the other ones. Like, I know a lot of Saints fans were going to be much more trepidatious about potential hirings of Harbaugh or Bill Belichick. Well, Harbaugh went to the Chargers, which, in my opinion, puts the AFC West as having arguably the best group of coaches in the league right now. I love that coaching set they have between Andy Reid, Harbaugh, and now Sean Payton. But even beyond that, you've got Bill Belichick not really picking up any, I would say, real interest. There's certainly been interviews, but nobody going after Bill Belichick. So we'll cover all of those. To that, everybody, let's go ahead and talk about everything, like all the things. Mike Alexander, King Arthur, Mr. Jerry Creo, King Saints Garcia, Mr. Holton 86, Tragic 504, James Griffon, Rainey, Jimbo Bruno, everybody. I know TJ's probably lurking in the background because he's always there, one of our moderators. Everybody, welcome in. Let's go ahead and talk about it. We're going to start with the big one that we're titling the podcast with. Rudy Rock, good to see you. NFC South head coaches seem set, but Falcons getting Raheem Morris, at least that seems to be the current plan. Now, for those that don't remember Raheem Morris has actually been in the NFC South before with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, although it's been quite a long time. Raheem Morris was with Tampa going back in the 2010s. That's a long time ago. Now, if you want to know specifically when he coached, you have to break it on down. Fun fact, he was with Hofstra, but he was with Tampa Bay as both head coach and defensive coordinator. He took both of those roles, 2009, 2010, and 2011. He was just the pure head coach. Then he was the head coach with Atlanta for a very short time, and now most recently was the defensive coordinator for the Los Angeles Rams. He was there for 3 years. Now, we've seen Morris, but I would argue that what you've seen from Morris is not something you want to jump to judgment. It's the same argument I made for DA. I know some people might take that as well. DA hasn't worked out, so this won't work out either. Again, we're talking about a guy that the last time you saw him as a head coach has been a decade. I'm not really counting the 2020 Atlanta thing because that was an interim coaching thing. So I don't really count that. I mean, not that I'm trying to discredit anybody that's an interim head coach, but I don't really give a lot of credit, blame, etc. to those type of situations because you're not getting to sit there and install everything. You're not getting to decide how things are going to be. He took over for Dan Quinn after Dan Quinn got released. So it wasn't really his team. He was simply in charge of managing it, and then they did not end up going with him afterwards. So I don't count that one. So the last time you saw Raheem Morris as a head coach is 2011 with Tampa Bay, literally over a decade ago. Now, he wasn't terrible, I guess we could say. Oh, man, it's really going to depend on how you judge this because I'm just going to keep it 100. You had one great year. I would call it a really, really good year. It's not a great. You had one really good year with Tampa. If you remember, that was the 2010 year. The New Orleans Saints, I wouldn't call it a Super Bowl hangover season, but that was 2010 where they went 10-6. But year one with Tampa, they went 3-13. Year three with Tampa, they went 4-12. And then when he was the interim coach with Atlanta, they went 4-7. So his career winning percentage is 35%, which is not good, right? Not good at all. That said, it has been over a decade. And if you want to use the man, the myth, the legend, Dennis Allen as an example, well, his record in 2 years with New Orleans is a 47% win percentage. It's not like he had Drew Brees to carry him there, even though his win percentage with the Raiders was 22%. So his career is 34%, actually very similar to what Raheem Morris is at. So I can't judge him harshly on something from a decade ago. And the way that it could affect New Orleans is we've seen the New Orleans Saints really focusing on offensive minds from that McVay coaching tree. So what you could see happen is actually just what happened in Houston, where you had a defensive-minded guy become the head coach. If the Atlanta Falcons do end up hiring Raheem Morris, as reports have said, Yahoo Sports had an article about it, and obviously it's all over Twitter. What that ends up meaning is somebody like Zach Robinson, who we talked about this past Tuesday on the previous Who Dat Confessional episode about being a guy that New Orleans was looking at for bringing in for their OC position. What could end up very likely happening is if Raheem Morris goes to Atlanta, he brings one of those guys from Los Angeles with him. And that way, that OC would have a familiar head coach versus coming into Dennis Allen's led New Orleans Saints. Now, that doesn't mean that, it knocks him out of the running or anything, but it is, something to note where we've seen this competition between some of these up-and-coming offensive minds around the league, which, speaking of, actually kind of makes it a little bit of a shock that the Carolina Panthers are hiring Dave Canales to be their head coach, who had that 1 year with Tampa. That was this year. That's kind of it. Again, none of this to talk trash about Canales. You don't really know what a guy is going to be until he gets a shot, right? So I'm not trying to, trash talk him in any way, shape, or form. But last year was his actual first season as an offensive coordinator, but he's been coaching in the NFL since 2010. So he's been in the league for over a decade. He was offensive quality control guy, worked his way up to assistant quarterbacks. He was wide receivers with Seattle before finally becoming the quarterback coach and then the passing game coordinator. So he's certainly gone up the track that you would see. It's just taken him quite a long time to get there. But obviously a guy that has had success with Seattle, and then last year having a middle of the road offense with Baker Mayfield and helping him kind of have a pretty good season as far as his career is concerned. Now getting a head coaching shot with the Panthers. My only thing with that is going to be that I don't trust the ownership situation in Carolina, and as much as I've talked about the Dallas Cowboys having the worst ownership situation in the league, I think Carolina's doing their damn best. And in this case, Tepper's doing his best to kind of take that mantle and wear it proudly. So very curious to see that. Again, not speaking negatively on him, but I will say that I am happier as someone who monitors coaches, so to speak, in the NFC South. And what brings me fear, I don't fear Canales going to the Panthers as I would somebody else. I'm not necessarily shocked to see individuals such as, Bill Belichick not getting a job at the moment, because Bill Belichick is looking for the same situation he had in New England. Not many owners are going to be willing to give him that level of control, right? Which, for those that don't remember, he was the de facto GM. He was the coach. He was in complete control of how that organization ran and certainly did fantastic with it. But you look at where you're at right now, don't see many guys willing to let you have that level of control. So you've got Raheem Morris supposedly going to Atlanta. Obviously, you have Tampa Bay's coach is set. Not going to see Bowles go anywhere after you have 2 straight playoff runs. I do realize that, they're coming off a quote-unquote rebuild after Tom Brady and everything, and the NFC South is wide open, but he's had 2 straight playoff runs, so you got that coach there. I don't necessarily fear Bowles. I'm very curious to see what they do offensive coordinator-wise. But as it stands right now, you're going to have Bowles in Tampa, Allen in New Orleans. You have Morris in Atlanta, if that goes through, and then finally Canales in Carolina for a very interesting set. Now, I would say this. One thing I will say that on paper, all this does for me is tell me that the NFC South is still just as wide open as it was in 2023. I'll admit that the level of coach I see Harbaugh as being, even from just the little standpoint of the organization and quality that he's going to bring and the standard that he's going to bring, regardless of whether he takes him to the Super Bowl, I think that there is a level of appreciation for a guy that you just know is good at being a leader of men, kind of a theme phrase we've been talking about a lot lately. I think he was going to bring that wherever he went. You don't know if you're going to get that with Raheem Morris, and you don't know if you're going to get that with Dave Canales. So New Orleans still is in the same position they were last year, where this division is completely open to anybody in the division. Again, don't want to make it sound like we're wearing black and gold rose-colored glasses. We are trying to be as objective as possible while also acknowledging that I don't see a lot changing here just based on head coaching changes. Now, Tragic says, I like Raheem Morris. He was so young when he took over. He's much improved and experienced now. I'm sure he's going to bring some of the coaches from the Rams and out-coach DA. We'll have to wait and see, Tragic. Now, again, and I said this, Tuesday, we do tend to be a little bit more, or not even a little bit, we tend to be much harsher looking inside our own house than we do outside. And the reason I say that is that if you look at Raheem Morris, he's never really done great in any particular year as a defensive mind. And my argument with that is the biggest issue with Atlanta for a long time has been their defense. They've got a lot of weapons on offense. While they don't have a quarterback of the future, nobody in the NFC South does at the moment. If you believe in Bryce Young, that's fine. I don't believe in Bryce Young as long as David Tepper keeps interfering with the 15 people that are trying to coach Bryce Young and changing who's being his coach at any given time. The thing with Morris is he's going to have to surround himself with guys who elevate the play and can do really well with the coordination aspect. But if you look at his history as defensive coordinator, whether you're talking about back when he was with Tampa or even with LA, he is yet to be a very good defensive coordinator. Whereas at least with the man, the myth, the legend, that is Dennis Allen, he has. But Dennis Allen has not shown that he's a great head coach. He's not. But he has shown he's a great defensive coordinator. Raheem Morris has not shown that, but he could be a great head coach. A good example of a great head coach who's not a great coordinator is Dan Campbell. Shout out to the Detroit Lions. Dan Campbell is not a great coordinator, play caller, etc. That's not his strength. He doesn't try to make it his strength. And I'm curious what this stint for Raheem Morris is going to be, because again, you don't see a lot of guys getting second opportunities as coaches. And this is going to be his second shot and likely his last. The reason I say last is he's going to be 48. And you assume that he's going to be in Atlanta at least 3 or 4 years, right? He's going to be in his 50s. Odds are that if this doesn't work out, he's not getting another shot. This is like his opportunity to cement himself with a good 10 years with a team and be good, like the Tomlins have done, like Peyton did, like Belichick did, like Pete Carroll did. The good coaches that stick around one place for a long time, you usually aren't getting that job when you're 50-something years old. There are exceptions to that, like Pete Carroll that I just mentioned. So, but if he's not successful now, odds are he doesn't get a third shot. So this is like his last hoorah attempt to be a head coach in the NFL. At least I believe so. I'm curious to see how it ends up working out for him. But I will say that when it comes to Atlanta, the biggest issues that I see with Atlanta, I don't see him just magically fixing by himself. Now, if he surrounds himself with some of these guys that we talked about, like I mentioned early in the podcast, where quite possible that he brings Zach Robinson with him as his OC. All these things could definitely change Atlanta's fate. And Atlanta's defense was better last year. They got real close to being top 10 for a while, kind of fell off a little bit, and ended up being the 18th best team in points allowed, but 11th best in yards allowed. So, you had seen some improvement there. Offense just never found any consistency. Very similar to New Orleans, but they actually scored way less points than New Orleans. I mean, it's as much trash as we have talked about the Saints and Dennis Allen, etc. I do feel like, and I'm not saying this because the games are over and we're in the offseason and I've forgotten how bad things were. But, the Saints did score over 400 points this year. Right. And the point I'm making is that the Saints have got the player talent on offense to score. The issue was getting any level of consistency from the play calling, from the offense as a whole, and from Derek Carr. So I think you have more of that in New Orleans than you have in Atlanta, where Atlanta struggled to score 320 points in 17 games. That's really poor a showing when you talk about them having an amazing duo at running back. When you talk about the Drake London and the Kyle Pitts, and sure, Desmond Ritter is nothing to get excited about necessarily, but I wouldn't say that he's just complete garbage either. I think with a good coordinator, maybe a Zach Robinson, you see an improvement there. So very curious to see how Morris creates a Falcons culture, and if it is a culture of winning, right? Who says Jim Harbaugh as well, great coach, but not as much of a coordinator. Well, Harbaugh's actually never been a offensive or special teams coordinator. Well, one of them hasn't. Now, every time I bring this up, I always forget which one it is. So one of them was a special teams coordinator. Crap. Which one was it? Was it Jim or no? So the one that just went to San Diego was a quarterback's coach. All right. John was a special teams coordinator. So we can bring up a Harbaugh. But funny thing about Jim Harbaugh, dude was never a coordinator at any level. That's kind of wild. Like, he was assistant coach with Western Kentucky way back in the day in the 90s. He was the quarterback coach for the Raiders. And then he was the head coach of San Diego in college, then Stanford, then San Francisco, and then obviously Michigan here. So he has never had a coordinator position at the highest levels. Wild. But his brother, John, was special teams coach, which not something that most people turn to when they talk about guys who are great, play callers. But I will say, my personal opinion, with the duo of Darren Rizzi and Phil Galliano in New Orleans, the special teams has been a much better unit as a whole over the past 5 or so 6 years than we've seen them kind of be in a long time. And that's the Darren Rizzi and Phil Galliano effect. Now, there have definitely been issues, right? We've talked about punting and kicking issues, but generally speaking, like the coverage units and everything have been very, very good. We've had multiple special teams Pro Bowlers. I think that says a lot, where it be Justin Hardy, the JT Grays. I mean, even some of your return guys like Deontay Harris/Hardy. I think that's really impressive, right? So you can definitely find those individuals, but they're pretty rare. And John Harbaugh was a special teams coordinator even in college. He was a special teams coordinator in the NFL, had 1 year as a defensive backs coach before becoming the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens, where he has been for over a decade. So themes, right? Themes. Tonight's show. Paul says, I don't know what the Saints are doing as far as the OC position, but it sure seems like deja vu. It doesn't to me, Paul, unless you're just simply talking about the process. And New Orleans is a take it slow, evaluate, and has always been that. And I didn't expect that to be any different. Like, I would say that if you expected that to change, you were setting yourself up for failure, if that was your expectation. And I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean that in an honest way. New Orleans was not going to go out and get somebody immediately. And part of that reason I would believe is some of the guys that they want the most are still in the playoffs. Now, the Rams guys aren't in the playoffs, but we know that there's been multiple players from the 49ers that they're interviewing, but you're not going to get Clint Kubiak in for an in-person interview when they have the NFC Championship game coming up. So if you are really trying to take from these, call them heralded coaching trees in the league right now, well, a lot of those guys aren't even available to have those type of meetings. And that's fine, right? So whether you want Zach Robinson, which I know a lot of people like, whether you want Johnson with Houston, who is their passing game coordinator, who just now became available with Houston getting eliminated, whether you want, Clint Kubiak, any of these, New Orleans was not going to just rush out and get somebody like I would say Carolina kind of went and did. I mean, and I'll admit the Dave Canales one kind of catches me by surprise. I mean, I wouldn't put him in the same conversations as some of these other guys that we've discussed. But again, the coaching thing is much more of a crapshoot from my perspective than player evaluation, because I think it's harder to evaluate coaches. Because coaches' jobs, no offense to players, is harder. Now, is it physically harder? Of course not. But, you're talking about a man who has to manage over 100 people and get the best out of 100 people while also building a system that leads to success. I mean, a head coach's job, no matter what level you're at, literally no matter what level you're at, whether you're doing it at a high school, collegiate level, that's the hardest job on the field. That doesn't mean that, quarterback's not the most difficult job when you're playing the game, but being a head coach, there's a reason that it's very difficult to find good ones, especially ones that are good for a long period of time. It's a very difficult role. It's a very stressful role. And give a lot of credit to what you see with guys like, the Harbaughs who have had success at every level and had it for a long time. And the guys like Belichick and Peyton with New Orleans, those are rare because you forget about the ones that just don't make it, right? You forget about literally the teams that just go through coaches like freaking water. I mean, just absolutely crazy. Good example. Take a look at the Cleveland Browns. So they got Stefanski now, right? But if you go all the way back to the time the Saints won the Super Bowl, 2009. So let's just go back 14 years. They had Mangini, then they had Schumer, then they had Shazinski for that very short time, Patine, Jackson. If you want to count Williams, but he was an interim, so we're not going to count Williams, but Kitchens, and then Stefanski. That's 7 guys in 14 years. That's a lot of coaches. It's tough to find a good head coach that you can rely on and trust and know that you're going to find some level of success. And that's just me rattling off that one. We could also go to the Raiders since 2009, had Cable, Jackson, Dennis Allen, Jack Del Rio, Gruden, McDaniels now recently. So that's 6. And that's not counting any of their interim coaches, which would be Sperano and Casilla or Pierce from this year, who is now going to probably, take over. It's tough to find a good coach. Like, that's difficult. So it's interesting to see how things are getting played out here, and also how you've got guys who a lot would probably consider legitimate head coach candidates like Bill Belichick not getting chosen over guys like Raheem Morris. I think a lot of that comes down to the level of control you probably expect Bill Belichick is asking for. And then just, you're not going to find as many owners who are willing to hand over that level of control. If Mickey Loomis didn't exist, Bill Belichick could probably come to New Orleans. Like, I could see Ms. Gale hiring Bill Belichick to handle all the things. But Mickey's not going anywhere. And I know Mr. Jerry comes in all the time talking about firing Mickey Loomis, but Mickey's not going anywhere. Not anytime soon anyway. So we'll see how that ends up playing out long term. I want Mickey to get, fully presidential, upgraded, whatever that ends up being. So there's another actual GM, but yeah, that is what it is. Stu says, and we talked about this Tuesday, Stu, but would I be personally disappointed if the New Orleans Saints ended up going with Ronald Curry over a McVay or Shanahan disciple? Short answer, no. Slightly longer answer, it's not my first choice. But at the same time, no. The reason I say that is, like, when I watch the games from this year and as the season went on, I'm a firm believer that you saw him, as in Curry, get more authority, more of a voice, more say. And I personally give him a lot of credit for the improvement of the offense at the end of the year, as well as giving it to Carmichael. How much of that can be given, only people inside the facility can know. I can't tell you for certain. Nick Underhill can't tell you for certain. Nobody besides people in the facility could answer that question. But when I go back and watch the tape and I see players' reactions and how they're interacting with him, and I see what's happening on the field, I feel like he got more and more of a say as the year went on. And you did start seeing the New Orleans Saints offense change. And not just like a little bit. I can give y'all some of the offensive splits. So let's talk about by games, like when they actually played during the year and how that offense did, to give what I would say is the best example. But I guess that there are other ways that we could kind of like break that down. But as the season progressed, you started seeing them do better in December, and you started to see, and everybody saw this, right? You started to see just about everything improve, whether it was the passing game, the running game. A great example to me, if we're talking about like total yards, the beginning of the season, from the first 6 games, you had one in the first 6 where you had over 300 yards of total offense. But take it a step further than that. You had one game above 250. Take it a step further than that. 4 of those games were 207 total yards or less. That is a really, really rough start. Or for example, you talk about like the last 6 or even hell, just the last 4 games of the year, a lot more in yardage, a lot more efficient in how they were moving down the field. And I'm not saying that they were great. I'm not. My argument is not that the New Orleans Saints were incredible. When you talk about the last, 6 games where they won, 4 of their last 5, or even where they lost to the Detroit Lions, you saw a much better overall team. I would say that you saw a much better overall team, right? Is that necessarily the case? Just speaking completely generally, probably not. But at the same time, I do think that you saw a much better squad as a whole. And that was, in my opinion, because we saw them change up who was in complete control of the offense. That is not for me to say that, conclusively, because I'm just kind of speaking out about what I see. And like when I go and look over some of these stats and some of the things that they did at the end of the year, I believe that you saw him have more of a role. But I can't say that for certain. So I would not be disappointed if Ronald Curry is chosen, because Ronald Curry is fresh. He's a new-blooded guy. He's, he has a fresh take on things. And I think that's okay. Curry is not somebody who has been in the league 20, 30 years and is just going to continue things as are. At least that's not what I think, right? This is a guy who played wide receiver, who was literally in the league not too long ago, because he got out of the league in 2008, has worked his way up, and I personally believe that he has earned a right to be an offensive coordinator, so I have no issue if he's the guy. But I don't have him as my number one, right? I don't have him as my number one. Paul says we need to get away from the Peyton era. Some agreement there, some not. Really hard for me to call Ronald Curry the Peyton era. I mean, yeah, he technically is. But I feel like it's almost disingenuous to say that. Here's why I say that. Because Ronald Curry wasn't like an offensive coordinator under Sean Payton. He wasn't a passing game coordinator. He was no type of coordinator under Sean Payton. When Sean Payton was here, the highest he had made it was wide receivers coach. He was an offensive assistant for 3 years. He was an offensive assistant with 2 years with the 49ers. I'm sorry, 4 years, because he had 2 years with New Orleans as well. This is not a guy who was in any level of like high-end leadership. This is a young guy. I mean, he's 44. And I think that he's earned an opportunity to try and be a coordinator. And I think that he's earned that. And I don't think he needs to be tainted by the idea that we need to move on from Sean Payton. Because to me, if you're talking about the Sean Payton aspect, I think it's bringing back guys like Doug Marrone, right? I think it's sticking with guys like Dennis Allen, because Dennis Allen, if you remember, this is his second stint with New Orleans. Dennis Allen was with us when we won the Super Bowl. It's easy to forget that, but Dennis Allen was here when we won the Super Bowl, right? Then he went off and did other things in other places, but he was in New Orleans for 5 years, 2006 to 2010. He was right here. And then he was only gone for 4 years before coming back. That is the type of thing you talk about, moving on from the Sean Payton era. I don't really think that Ronald Curry is part of that, right? Ronald Curry is just a young up-and-coming guy who got spotted, brought in, and he's grown under multiple regimes now. I mean, the guy the past 2 years had nothing to do with Sean Payton, yet he still had to progress, learn, become better at his craft. So, again, I don't give him, like, he's not my top choice for New Orleans, but at the same time, I wouldn't be upset. Like, I don't feel like they are doing a cruise control, keep it moving in the same direction, if that makes sense. Because there's just as much unknown about my favorite choice in Clint Kubiak, right? Like, I think Clint Kubiak gets a little bit of slander he doesn't deserve in regards to the 1 year he was an offensive coordinator, right? And the 1 year he was an offensive coordinator was 2021 in Minnesota. He had worked his way up under Mike Zimmer, finally got the chance to be the OC, and then Zimmer gets fired. And as typically happens when a head coach gets fired, all the staff gets wiped. So he got wiped. He was gone. And then Kevin O'Connell came in, who was an offensive-minded guy, and that was it. Kevin O'Connell came in, and it's his thing now. So he wasn't going to keep Clint Kubiak. But Kubiak, in my opinion, did not do a bad job when he did have the 1 year as an offensive coordinator with Minnesota. I don't feel like he did a bad job. I don't feel like he did a bad job when he was with Denver as an assistant. At least nothing that I can find says that he did a bad job. And, that year with Minnesota, they did pretty well offensively. It was Minnesota's defense that struggled so much. 2021, Minnesota, it wasn't the offense that was being terrible. It was the fact that their defense was the 30th ranked defense in the NFL. So you get opportunities and then sometimes things get yanked out from under you. But even Clint Kubiak's a complete unknown, right? You really going to say that you can conclusively say he's going to be good? I certainly can't, and he's my favorite candidate. So I'm good with anything because I don't believe that you're continuing the old and moving on with, sticking with it. Sticking with the tree is Pete Carmichael. Like, sticking with the tree is a guy that you have seen in the house for over a decade. No other NFL team is trying to hire him and make him a guy. And yet you're like, yeah, we're going to keep him around for 2 years while our, best players sputter and get older. And the offense never takes off under 3, technically 4 different quarterbacks. To me, that's the difference. But if you don't agree, that's completely okay. Mr. Don says, Loomis has it made. I wouldn't leave if I were him either. Mrs. Benson would never fire him. Hard to imagine that ever happening, right? Especially because of how much trust Mr. Benson had in him. And that seems to have passed on to Mrs. Gale, right? And I don't say this in a negative way because I think that it's only natural to have a favorite. Anytime you have children, any parent can tell you there's a favorite. And if they say they don't have one, they're lying. The Pelicans were always her favorite, even though she loves the Saints. Like, she goes to the practices. She's there in the facility. She meets with the players. She meets with the coaches. She is very involved with the Saints. I still feel like the Pelicans are her baby, though. She loves the Pelicans and she loves the Saints. It's said exactly like that, right? What does she get more excited about? The Pelicans beating the tar out of the Utah Jazz the other night and setting a franchise record with 153 points, and CJ McCollum going off for 33, and Zion actually looking slimmed down as the season's gone on and making me look like a fool for trash talking him and getting a double-double with assist? Or does she get more excited about us beating the brakes off the Falcons? I think she gets more excited about beating the brakes off the Jazz. I think she likes both. And because of that, she's going to trust her late husband's thoughts on guys like Mickey Loomis who are running things. And I don't mean to say that truly in any negative way towards Miss Gale. But I think that what has always been her thing is the Pelicans. But she also, she loves both children. Pelicans are her favorite. And that means it's going to be really hard to move off guys like Mickey Loomis. And that means that you're going to have Mickey Loomis smacking gum and talking about how Dennis Allen could be the next Hall of Fame head coach. Now, obviously, the 100 people listening live don't believe that. But that is how it is. And by the way, shout out to the Pelicans for beating the Jazz 153 to 124. I love that game. It was incredibly fun to watch. And I hope we see more of that. The next time the Pelicans play, for those curious, is tomorrow night. The Thunder coming into town. Pelicans play them after some rest. And I hope that as a team, they continue to stay healthy and play good basketball. They're not the number 1 seed as they were, at one point last year, but hell, we're halfway through the season and they're winning like 59% of their games. And that's good. And I still don't know if I trust them to be a deep playoff team, but I'll say this about the Pelicans, man. They playing some fun basketball. And I still want to see Zion be better. I've said my piece about Zion and how I don't really trust him. But hell, he's played 36 games this year. I'm giving him credit for that. I will sit here and say when he's doing better than I expect, he's doing better than I expect in some ways. In other ways, he's not. At various points this year, I've thought that he looked kind of like his normal, not dominant self. But hell, man, you watch him against the Jazz, him being everything was impressive, right? I still don't think he's scoring as much as he should. I am very curious why he's taking even less 3 attempts than he ever has when he actually is a semi-decent 3-point shooter for a guy his size. But I will say this, better or worse, this season he has played the second most games he has his entire career in the NBA. Only year that he played more games than he has this year was 2021. It's the only year, 2020/2021. And that was 61 games. He's on pace for about that same amount. So, go Zion, please be good. Anyway, back to New Orleans football talk. But we love the Pelicans too here. Those that don't know, I love all New Orleans teams. I do. Don says I don't see it as a negative or positive, that being Mickey Loomis and being where he is, or I'm sorry, Miss Gale viewing things how they do. It just is how it is. I don't necessarily have a good or bad opinion about Mickey Loomis either. I mean, I don't think that Mickey Loomis is the best GM in the league. I don't think he's the worst. And again, I think that as Saints fans, when things aren't going as well as we want them to, and I do agree that they should be better, we are hypercritical. We've always been that way. We were hypercritical about Sean Payton when they went 7-9 3 years in a row. And I think that we were hypercritical justifiably. Because if you are underperforming to that degree, something needs to happen. I think that's completely legit, and there's nothing wrong with being hypercritical. But being hypercritical can make you skew the view a little bit too much sometimes. Because there are worse guys out there than Mickey as a person who runs a franchise. At the same time, he's not the best. It's kind of like the same thing where, in my opinion, the Saints scouting department has gotten a lot of trash talk lately. Oh, the Saints can't draft. I'm like, what do you mean? The Saints are drafting perfectly fine. The Saints are drafting better than most teams in the NFL. Their hit rate, their success rate is higher than almost every NFL team. The problem is, as I've said before, you have your head coach now, who's also DC at one time, has a very particular type. He continues to want to try to find a defensive end. So you're spending multiple high-end draft picks to continue to try to find that guy and find one that's healthy and consistent, which is going to skew your view, right? Great example, Peyton Turner. Again, it's not me trying to trash talk Peyton Turner, because I don't believe that players can control, one, where they're drafted, or two, how they get injured. But Peyton Turner was a first-round pick. Some of the people drafted after Peyton Turner. Gregory Rousseau with Buffalo has 17 sacks, right? Well, Peyton Turner has 3. So is also younger. It's easy to have revisionist history. And he's also one of the guys who I think could fit DA's system. But he got picked 2 picks later, right? He's been healthy, healthy-ish, healthier, played more games, 46 games. Peyton Turner's only played 15 games, right? That's 2 picks later. Or hell, Elijah Moore, wide receiver to the New York Jets. Dude's got 1,600 yards receiving and 8 TDs. That's nothing to shake a stick at. You know, Azeez Ujulari. I don't necessarily think he fits as well to New Orleans, but still a guy that's gotten 16 sacks. So there were opportunities maybe for other positions or even other players who maybe had a slightly better record. You know, hell, Pat Freiermuth at tight end, because tight end wasn't working for New Orleans. Then he got picked in the second round. I'm not saying pick him in the first. I'm simply saying that there are other guys that maybe could have gotten picked, but you had somebody really honed in on this position, this type. This is what we need. You did it several times. But the only other issue besides that particular one is I don't think the Saints draft enough people. In 2023, they drafted 7 players, and I have no real issue with anybody they drafted. Brian Brzee, loved him as a rookie. I think he did really well. Isaiah Foskey, you didn't really get to see a lot of him, but we'll see how he pans out. Second-round pick. Kendre Miller was injured, but when we did see him, we loved him. Nick Saldiveri, he's going to be a guy that took time to develop, but you did end up seeing him having snaps this year. Jake Haener is Jake Haener. He's a 4th-round quarterback choice, but then Jordan Howden, huge draft pick. A.T. Perry, huge draft pick. 2023 was a stud draft in terms of guys who touched the field year 1 and contributed. That is everything you want. 2022, take away the Trevor Penny thing that didn't really work out. Alontae Taylor, Chris Olave, and DeMarco Jackson are all still on the team and all contribute, with Chris Olave and Alontae Taylor contributing at a very high level. That's a win, but here's the problem. You only drafted 5 people in 2022. That's it. 5 guys. That's all, right? 2020, that's the one that everybody loves to hate on, but it's easy to hate on it because it was Cesar Ruiz, Zach Bond, Adam Trautman, Tommy Stevens. 4 people, that's it, point blank, done. They need to draft more guys, stop trading away their draft picks, and stop hyper-fixating on a singular position and prototype. As we always talk about, draft the best player available regardless of position. That's what gives you success, and they basically have done that as a draft except for one position. And they get hyper-fixated on Dennis Allen's defensive end prototype. But when they do the scouting department's best player available for this team, they have found really good people, really deep in the draft, consistently. But Saints fans have a tendency to hyperfixate on the failures, like Marcus Davenport being a two first and never being healthy, or Peyton Turner being a first rounder and never healthy, or the fact that Isaiah Foskey didn't really touch the field, but he didn't really have an opportunity to touch the field because you had Carl Granderson, a bona fide starter, Cameron Jordan, complete opposite side, by the way. And then you had reliable backups while Foskey needed development. But there's a lot of success in the New Orleans Saints drafting over even just the past 5 years. I mean, it's not necessarily sexy, but Pete Warner is a very good starter for this team. Paulson Debo is a great starter with this team. Landon Young has been a quality depth guy, especially with the Saints injuries. The only misses from 2021 are Ian Book and Kawan Baker. And Peyton Turner's an unknown, probably going to end up being a miss if he can't be healthy this year. But even then, you found 3 guys who contribute and 2 long-term starters. That is a win in almost every NFL team's draft book. If they can get 2 legit starters every single draft, plus you get them from the free agency, like if you average 2 starters a draft, that is a huge win. This past draft, they averaged 2 starters because Howden's going to be a starter, Brzee is going to be a starter, Kendre Miller probably will be a starter, and hopefully 2 of those others become starters, maybe even 3. Huge draft. Now, they might not be Hall of Famers, but that's still good. That's still good. So, as much negative as there is to be talked about with New Orleans, there's so much positive. And the whole point of this little 15-minute run is sometimes we hyperfixate a little bit too much on the negative, whereas it's not all doom and gloom on this team because we can point out other teams that do not draft very well. Right? Like we can look at teams around the league who really struggle with that, who really don't develop very well. And those teams are, well, they are what they are. But I think you get the point that I'm making. We as a fan base, and I'm probably sure every fan base has this problem, we tend to hyperfixate. But just to give you an example, take a look at the Washington Commanders. We know Washington's been a hellhole for a long time. Washington drafts a lot of people, but very rarely do a lot of those people pan out. Here's you a great example. We just talked about the New Orleans Saints 2021 draft class. Peyton Turner, Pete Warner, Paulson Debo, Ian Book, Landon Young, Kawan Baker. 6 guys, 3 of them being legitimate starters / contributors, and one of them, if he stops being injured, maybe could be something. So 4. In that same year, Washington drafted Jamin Davis, Samuel Cosme, Benjamin St-Juste, Miami Brown, John Bates, Derek Forrest, Cameron Cheeseman, William Bradley King, Shaka Toney, and Dax Milne. They drafted 10 guys. However, of all of those guys, how many of them have actually been valuable players to a team? 3 of them. It was the first 3 picks. That's it. 3. Jamin Davis, linebacker. I would say that he's done pretty well. He was the 19th overall pick in 2021. Cosme, offensive lineman, has played 40 games and has been a consistent starter for them. And then at DB, Benjamin, he's played 37 games. I would say he's been solid. But you look at everybody else, it's a whole bunch of Most of those guys not even getting significant snaps. And you can tell that, like, if you go to places like Pro Football Reference, and they'll do adjusted value ratings for how much a player has impacted a team or how much they've contributed. And you can get some guys who do develop and become players who do more. Like, for example, Derek Forrest, who I mentioned. He ended up becoming the starter in the second year, but he's only really played 1 year of football. He didn't start as a rookie, and then last year only played 5 games. That's safety. So all these different teams, you drafted 10 guys, and you got 3 out of 10. That's 30%. New Orleans is consistently hitting over 50%. So again, it's just that hyperfixation of, like, it's okay to acknowledge the negatives, and they 100% are there. But at the same time, there's good to be found and good to be recognized. Should get called out, right? He just says, Jonathan Sullivan said, I was a whack first rounder. Peyton Turner, hold my beer. I can't say that about Peyton Turner because his issue has been injury, not even performance. Like, I'm not going to blame a guy for being injured. Some guys' bodies just can't handle the NFL, but I'm not going to get mad at them for it. Jonathan Sullivan just sucked, right? That's a different one. That's a different one. Jackson Saints probably blabbed about their pick in case he knew. Which pick? We talking about the trying to go after Patrick Mahomes and ended up with Marsh Latimore? I'm sure somebody knew, which is why KC traded up. It is what it is. M. Dot says, I know we're not the worst, but we've tasted success. It's hard to shake that. So when we see this mediocre mess, it's frustrating. But I do realize other teams are worse. And I would actually argue a lot of other teams are worse when it comes to drafting. A lot of other teams are worse when it comes to cap management. I wouldn't say necessarily a lot of other teams are worse when it comes to who's their head coach. But there's a lot in New Orleans that keeps them where they're at, which is a team with a winning record. And for all the negative we can say about them, this is not a bottom of the barrel franchise. And that's a good thing because I don't want to return to being the bottom of the barrel. We'll see what they are in 2024. We've yet to see them return to being bottom of the barrel. And if the worst that they end up being is mediocre, that's fine. You can coast on mediocrity until you find what you need to find. You don't have to. Like, there's this illusion. I call it an illusion because I don't believe in it. But there are a lot of fans out there that believe you should just tank and suddenly having the number 1, number 2 pick is going to make you a good team. And historically, that's not accurate. Like, can you get the number 1 pick and that help you out tremendously? Yeah, because generally those guys can go get the best quarterback in the draft and then build around that. And that's fine. But that's not a great way for consistent long-term success. And if you slowly build it, I think you can find that. And that's fine. You can find examples of that working. That's completely okay, right? But I would much rather have a team be 9-8, figuring out that Dennis Allen's not the way, and then have a good core, a good scouting department, a good player set, a good set of players for a new coach to come in and work with instead of doing like you see a lot in college, which college coaches will come in, bench all the seniors and stuff, and start playing all the freshmen. And sure, they'll suck for a year or two, but then by year 3 and year 4, they rebuilt the franchise. No, they didn't. They just ran the same players for 3 years and made them into a great team, right? So I'm okay with being mediocre as long as it's moving in the right direction, even if that direction is not Dennis Allen. That's just how I view things. Jackson's not tanky, but you can trade down and accumulate draft capital. Now, that I agree with, Jack. I've never argued. And hell, we talk about it every draft, how I wish they would draft down and stop trading up. I mean, I just talked about how the issue in New Orleans, they don't draft enough people. That's a big issue. There are 2 issues of drafting. I feel like New Orleans is a better scouting and drafting team than most teams in the NFL. I believe that. They still have 2 glaring errors with their draft strategy, in my opinion. Number 1 is a hyperfixation on the defensive end prototype. And number 2, it's not having enough draft picks. They always trade back. I hate that. But at the same time, I still believe that they are a very, very good team. I really, really hate that aspect about them. They've got the 14th overall pick this year. We'll see what they end up doing with it. But as long as it's not a freaking defensive end to do the same thing you've been doing, I'm probably going to be okay with it. But, I say that, watch them go get, like Jared Verse out of Florida State. I'm like, gosh, dang it. Like, what are we doing here? I'm not necessarily saying he fits. I just pulled out an edge name that came to mind. You can say Dallas Turner. I don't care. But point being, just like, oh, gosh, here we go again. And figuring out. And they do desperately need, in my opinion, defensive end. But, it's just whoever is the best player, take that. Take that. And if it is Verse, fine. Whoever the best is, do that. So. And Don says I wouldn't be upset with Jared Verse. I mean, again, I just threw out a name that I was just thinking of names. But, for example, a lot of discussions been had about trading Marsh Latimore. Okay. Trade Marsh Latimore. I'm not going to fuss and fight over that if you believe that's the right move for you, because generally the older a corner gets, he is going to fall off because skill positions, that's big. That's big. But if an Amarius Mims is there or J.C. Latham and you feel like they really fit your squad, you take that. You take that and you run with it. And you find success with it. At least you try to. Instead of saying, hey, we really need this position. Whoever's the best player, that's the strategy. You don't know about trading Latimore? I'm honestly okay with it if it nets a good return. Now, if they trade Marshawn Latimore for a 4th-round pick, waste. If somebody gives a good value for Latimore, I'm 100% okay with trading him. They picked up the tab because of how they did his bonus. They pick up some of the tab of his contract, and New Orleans has 2 young stud outside corners waiting. I'm okay with that. If somebody offers a 4th-round pick, it's not worth unloading his contract on, but it seems like that's what they're working on. And they've got until September to do it. But yeah, I mean, you get somebody that throws you a 2nd-round pick for Latimore, I'd take that. I would. Like, I don't know, not everybody's going to like to hear that, but Latimore's getting older, and Latimore's not going to get better. Latimore has already started to show a little bit of like injuries creeping in. Past 2 years, he's had injuries. Now, what New Orleans is going to do is try to be like, hey, we got a guy who just won 3 Pro Bowls in the past 5 years. Like, they're going to really try to, he's healthy now, all these other things. He's going to be 28. I do think his prime cornerback days, he's still in his prime now. I could trade him for a 2nd rounder, and I've got 2 guys who are 3 or 4 years younger than him, literally, who can come in and replace him. I'd do it. I'd do it. Jimbo says, I'd rather have Latimore than the 50th pick in the draft. He's 27. He'll be 28. 2 injured seasons. And you say that, however, Alontae Taylor was picked 49. Paulson Debo was picked 76. And both of those guys, because the scouting department is so good, and Dennis Allen actually is good when it comes to secondary, those 2 guys can come in and start right now for this team and be very good players on the outside. So if you got pick 50, you got another corner if you wanted it, or somebody else, and use your 1st-round pick on a corner. Because who says you can't draft Cooper DeJean? Who says you can't draft him in the 1st round if he's the best player available for your team? Who says? Doesn't say that just because you trade Latimore, you can't draft another one. And if you could get another high-end rookie corner on a rookie deal, thumbs up from me. So I'm not trying to run Latimore out the building. I'm just simply saying it's a very viable option, and I'm not going to turn down getting rid of the salary and getting a good draft pick because, as we just said, what this team needs is to draft more players. You draft more players. I think that's the biggest thing this team needs more than anything else is to draft more players. If they do that, I think that's where they have success. Because also remember, the Saints don't really have many picks in the top 100. They actually only have 2. Really only have 2 in the top 150. So if you could grab something like that, that'd help you out quite a bit, I'd say. But anyway, I mean, we'll see how things play out. We'll see how things play out. Are we going to have any cornerbacks? Yeah. The Saints have got depth now. And I love that. That's why they can be in the position where if they wanted to trade Latimore, they can. So this is one of the rare times where I would trust the Saints and Dennis Allen. When it comes to DBs, there's very little you can fault the DBs over the past 6 years. Very little. Here and there, sure, problems. This has been a deep and consistent group for a long time. Defensive line, we got problems. But anyway, maybe we can talk about that more because we're going to do a mock draft next week. So Taylor got benched too much to get rid of Latimore. Taylor got benched twice as a nickel corner. That is not the same as when he played outside because here's the thing, IB. When he did get benched in those games, he still played in those games, but he only played as the outside corner. They trust him on the outside. They trust Alontae Taylor on the outside. They did not trust him in his first year as a nickel corner. So I don't think that's an example that we can use. If anything, it actually shows how much confidence they still had in Alontae Taylor. They just knew that he was not picking up the new position as well as they wanted. Because Alontae Taylor, even when he got benched, still was playing on the field. They just moved him to the outside. That's okay. I'll live with that. And we knew what he was. His rookie year, he was great on the outside. And I would think that, I would even argue that he was solid on the inside this year, but you could tell that he wasn't very familiar or comfortable in it yet. And there were definitely games where teams would take advantage of him in that spot. But he still didn't do bad. Here's his year numbers. This year, he allowed a quarterback rating of 85.6 and a completion percentage of 60%, and he was targeted 102 times. The teams clearly tried to pick on him. Here's where he struggled this year. Missed tackles. Alontae Taylor was abysmal this year in missed tackles. He led the team in missed tackles. But his numbers of what he gave up were not bad. Last year, he gave up a 62 quarterback rating and a 48% completion percentage, doing primarily outside coverage. I think that he just didn't operate well on the inside. But I still think that he was a very good corner, fits the system well as an outside guy. That's just me. Please stop trying to trade off all great players in our prime. No, because I'm not trying to trade all of them. I definitely wouldn't get rid of Chris Olave. But Marshawn Latimore, when you have the depth behind him, he's hitting 28, which he's at the end of his prime, and he's coming off 2 injured seasons. I would trade that. Yeah, I would. You were at the Colts game when Manning kept going to Jason David's side. He knew. Yeah, and then Manning had proceeded to ruin Jason David the rest of the year. Wild. Jason David was the poor man's Marcus Peters. Very poor man Marcus Peters. Because I remember with New Orleans, crazy stat, he played New Orleans 2 years. He started 18 games. He had 8 interceptions. He just also happened to give up a lot of big plays. He was a very poor man's Marcus Peters. Very poor man. They just very low end version. He got you some good turnovers, but yeah, not great overall. Not great overall. You would not hope that was your total package. So you'll trade Latimore, sign GJ to the inside, move Taylor to the outside. He's definitely not coming back. He's definitely not coming back. You have depth until just one gets hurt? No, you still have depth beyond that. That's the statement I don't get. Because Latimore didn't play most of the season. And you still had injuries to other guys. And you had depth everywhere in the DB room. So I can't argue that. It wasn't like the Saints only had 2 corners and Latimore was one of them. No, the Saints had multiple really good corners this year. So much so that's why they moved on from Bradley Roby. Right? Like, Paulson Debo played fantastic. Ugo Amadi played very good in the slot. Right? Wasn't the only one. Latimore played well, but so did Isaac Yiadom. Alontae Taylor played really well on the outside and okay in the slot, but in some games he got taken advantage of. Lonnie Johnson, did he play bad? The veteran they brought in at a very cheap contract? The Saints have depth at corner. It wasn't just like, oh, you've got a Debo and oh, you got Taylor, and then it's a whole bunch of like Rev Deuces out there behind them. They did well. What happened with CJ? He burned every bridge inside the facility. Like all of them. That man set fire to all the bridges. All of them. I'd be very, very shocked to see him come back to New Orleans. Very shocked. Very, very shocked. And I don't think he wants to either. I think he's quite happy where he's at now. So, but I mean, hell, he burned a bridge to a literal team that took him to the Super Bowl. I'm not speaking negatively about the man. I'm just speaking facts. This is a dude that we followed each other on Twitter and we're on Twitch together. Right? Like, I got nothing negative to say about him as a person, but I'm saying, like, situationally, realistically, he burned bridges. He sleep with a teammate's wife? No, although that has happened in New Orleans before. That's not what happened with him. But yeah, I mean, look, I get the idea of how it can be hard to swallow the idea of trading Latimore, but at the same time, they've kind of already started that process with how they did, his option. So, yeah, we'll see what they do. My only opinion is, do I think that Marshawn Latimore makes this team better? Absolutely. Do I think this team plays well without Marshawn Latimore and wouldn't hurt themselves to move on? Also can be true, right? Because the Saints' biggest struggles are not going to change if Latimore's not there, nor does he make them better in where they suck, which is that front seven. Anyway, we can talk about this more next week when we do our mock drafts. And hey, if you disagree with that, that's completely okay. Y'all are all incredible. I love every single one of you. I appreciate all of y'all coming in and enjoying the podcast, especially here in the offseason where we're going to get really spicy and saucy as we get next to the draft. It's coming up. I tell you, quicker than you realize. Who dat? God bless. Catch y'all all on the next Who Dat Confessional podcast. Appreciate you. Share this out with everybody here in the offseason, and make sure you check it up on the rerun. iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, iHeart Radio, etc. Love y'all. Deuces. That's me.